Every morning, a bobcat taps on a family's window as if asking for something. One day, the father decides to follow it, and what he discovers deep in the woods will change everything. A hidden den, a desperate cry for help, and the looming threat of poachers. How far will he go to protect this fragile connection to nature? And what secrets will he uncover along the way? Don't miss this powerful story of courage, redemption, and the bond that can form between man and the wild. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The pale light of dawn crept through Francis O'Connor's kitchen window as he sat alone at his small wooden table. Steam rose from his coffee mug, curling in the dim glow of the single lamp on the counter. The house was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but Francis had grown used to the silence in the years since Martha's passing. Some mornings, the emptiness felt like a physical presence, wrapping around him like a familiar but unwelcome blanket. He wrapped his weathered hands around the warm ceramic mug, his thoughts drifting as he gazed out at the shadowy yard. The trees stood like dark sentinels against the lightening sky, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. A cardinal flitted between the branches, a flash of red in the growing light. Tap, tap. The sound was so soft that Francis almost missed it. He blinked, focusing his eyes on the window. His breath caught in his throat, and the mug in his hands trembled slightly. There, pressed against the glass, was a bobcat's paw. Francis sat completely still, afraid even the slightest movement might startle the creature. The wild cat's amber eyes met his, intense and unblinking. Time seemed to stop as they stared at each other, neither moving. Francis felt his heart beating faster, not from fear, but from a strange sense of wonder. Something in those eyes seemed almost knowing. As quickly as it had appeared, the bobcat vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Francis wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. He released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and set his mug down with shaking hands. Later that morning, with the sun now warming the spring air, Francis stepped out onto his front porch. The wooden boards creaked under his feet as he surveyed his yard. The grass sparkled with dew, and that's when he noticed them. Distinct paw prints pressed into the damp earth near his window. Each print was perfectly formed, like nature's own signature. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, carefully stepping off the porch. The tracks were clear as day, leading away from the house toward the dense woods at the edge of his property. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of spring flowers. Following the trail, Francis walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground. The paw prints continued in a straight line until they reached the old wooden fence that marked the boundary between his land and Reed Thompson's property. The tracks grew fainter in the pine needles and eventually disappeared altogether, swallowed by the forest floor. Francis rested his hand on the weathered fence post, remembering the heated arguments he'd had with Reed over property lines 2 summers ago. Reed had insisted the fence was 3 feet too far into his land, and their disagreement had led to months of cold shoulders and averted gazes when they crossed paths in town. Even now, the memory of those bitter words made him wince. Standing there now, Francis wondered if he should tell anyone about the bobcat. Reed, despite their differences, knew these woods better than anyone. But the thought of approaching his neighbor made Francis's stomach twist uncomfortably. The last thing he needed was Reed accusing him of making up stories, or worse, using it as an excuse to start another argument. Some wounds were still too fresh. Back inside his kitchen, Francis settled into his chair again. The morning sun now filled the room with warm light, making the earlier encounter feel even more surreal. He looked out at his empty yard, a mix of excitement and confusion stirring in his chest as he replayed the mysterious encounter in his mind. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time he'd see that bobcat, and the thought filled him with both anticipation and unease. The pale light of dawn crept through Francis O'Connor's kitchen window as he sat alone at his small wooden table. Steam rose from his coffee mug, curling in the dim glow of the single lamp on the counter. The house was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but Francis had grown used to the silence in the years since Martha's passing. Most mornings he found comfort in these peaceful moments before the world fully awakened. He wrapped his weathered hands around the warm mug, letting his thoughts drift like the morning mist outside. His wedding ring caught the lamplight, a gentle reminder of happier times. That's when he heard it, a soft tap against the window glass. At first, he thought it might be a branch blown by the wind, but the sound came again, more deliberate this time. Francis turned his head slowly toward the window, and his breath caught in his throat. There, just inches from the glass, stood a bobcat. Its tawny fur was dappled with morning shadows, and its paw rested gently against the window. But it was the eyes that held him frozen in place. Amber-colored and intense, they seemed to look straight into his soul. Something about those eyes reminded him of Martha's. The same quiet wisdom, the same gentle strength. Neither moved. Francis barely breathed. The moment stretched between them like a thread of silk, delicate and surreal. Time seemed to stand still in the soft morning light. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Francis stepped out onto his front porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. His old flannel jacket barely kept out the morning chill. His eyes immediately caught sight of distinct paw prints in the soft soil near his steps. They formed a clear trail leading away from the house, each impression perfect and precise. His heart quickened as he followed the tracks, each print a perfect signature in the morning dew. The wet grass soaked the hem of his jeans as he walked. But as he approached the dense woods at the edge of his property, the trail began to fade. The prints grew fainter until they disappeared altogether near the old wooden fence that marked the boundary with Reed Thompson's land. Francis stood there, hands in his pockets, studying the spot where the tracks vanished. The fence brought back memories of heated arguments with Reed over property lines and fallen trees. Their last dispute had left a bitter taste that lingered even now, 2 years later. The morning birds sang overhead, oblivious to the property lines that divided their territory. Should he tell someone about the bobcat? Reed might need to know. The animal had crossed onto his property after all. But Francis could already imagine the skeptical look on his neighbor's face, the dismissive wave of his hand. The memory of their last argument, with Reed's face red with anger, was still too fresh. Maybe it was better to keep this strange encounter to himself, at least for now. Walking back to the house, Francis felt oddly unsettled. His boots left their own trail alongside the bobcat's prints. He returned to his kitchen and sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the window where the bobcat had appeared. The yard was empty now, but the memory of those piercing eyes stayed with him. A mix of excitement and confusion stirred in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time he'd see his mysterious visitor. The first rays of sunlight hadn't yet touched the horizon when Francis settled into his familiar spot at the kitchen table. This morning felt different. He had a mission. A small notepad lay open before him, pen poised and ready. He'd written the date at the top of the page in his careful handwriting, followed by 5:47 a.m., beginning observation. His coffee sat untouched as his eyes stayed fixed on the window. The wait wasn't long. At 6:03 a.m., the bobcat emerged from the morning shadows. Francis's hand trembled slightly as he recorded the time, watching the creature approach with measured steps. Like clockwork, it raised its paw to tap the glass, those remarkable amber eyes meeting his once again. This time, when the bobcat turned to leave, Francis was ready. He grabbed his light jacket from the hook by the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The bobcat paused at the tree line, as if waiting before disappearing into the undergrowth. Francis followed, his footsteps careful on the damp ground. The forest closed around him as he ventured deeper than before. Ferns brushed against his legs, and thick moss cushioned his steps. The terrain grew more challenging. Small hills and fallen logs forced him to watch his footing carefully. The bobcat stayed just visible ahead, moving with fluid grace through the forest. Francis's breath came harder as he climbed a small rise, pushing through a patch of dense vegetation. Then suddenly, the forest opened into a small clearing. Francis pressed himself behind a broad oak tree, his heart pounding. The bobcat had stopped near a rocky outcropping where nature had created a perfect den between two large stones. As Francis watched, two small heads poked out from the shadows, cubs, their spotted fur still fuzzy with youth. Their mother settled at the entrance, positioning herself where she could watch both her babies and the surrounding forest. The scene before him made Francis's throat tight with emotion. The cubs tumbled over each other playfully, while their mother kept her vigilant watch. It was a moment of pure wilderness, untouched and perfect. Francis stood completely still, hardly daring to breathe, not wanting to disturb this precious family moment. After several minutes of quiet observation, Francis carefully began his retreat. Once he was far enough away, he pulled out his phone and dialed Emily's number. When it went to voicemail again, he spoke softly, but with warmth in his voice. "Emily, honey, I saw something amazing today. Something that reminded me of when you and Daniel were little. I'd really love to tell you about it. Call me when you can." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The morning's wonder stayed with him, even as Emily's continued silence weighed on his heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Francis's yard as he pulled some weeds near the old wooden fence. The rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Reed Thompson, his face set in its usual scowl, marched toward him. "O'Connor!" Reed's voice carried across the yard. "What's the big idea leaving all this dead brush along my property line?" Francis straightened up slowly, his knees creaking. "Hello, Reed. I haven't left any brush near your property." "Then what's all that mess over there?" Reed jabbed a finger toward a pile of branches and leaves that had collected naturally against the fence. "That's just fallen debris from the last storm," Francis explained calmly. "I was actually planning to clear it away this week." Reed crossed his arms. "Well, see that you do. I won't have your mess spilling onto my land." Francis opened his mouth, the story of the bobcat sitting on the tip of his tongue. The morning's magical encounter felt important enough to share, even with Reed. But looking at his neighbor's stern face, he thought better of it. Reed would probably laugh it off, or worse, see it as another reason to complain. "I'll take care of it soon," Francis said instead. After Reed stomped away, Francis went inside and settled at his computer. He typed bobcat behavior into the search bar, clicking through various wildlife websites. He learned that bobcats were usually shy and avoided human contact. Their unusual behavior, like approaching houses, typically meant they were either sick or desperate for food. But the mother bobcat hadn't seemed sick at all. She'd looked healthy and alert, protective of her cubs. As Francis scrolled further, a local news headline caught his eye. Authorities investigate reports of wildlife poaching in county parks. His heart seemed to skip a beat as he read about illegal traps found in nearby forests. The article mentioned bobcats specifically as targeted animals, their fur valuable on the black market. Francis pushed back from the computer, his hands trembling slightly. The thought of those beautiful creatures being hunted made his stomach turn. He pictured the tiny cubs he'd seen that morning, so vulnerable in their den. The kitchen grew darker as evening settled in. Francis sat by the window, peering out at the shadowy woods. The trees that had always been a peaceful presence now seemed to hide potential dangers. He thought about the mother bobcat, how she'd sought him out, tapping on his window 3 mornings in a row. Maybe she'd sensed something in him, someone who would help protect her family. His resolve hardened as he watched the darkness deepen. Tomorrow morning, he would return to check on them. He couldn't stand by and do nothing while poachers threatened these magnificent animals. The woods looked more menacing than ever in the gathering night, but Francis felt his fear overshadowed by a stronger emotion: determination. These creatures needed help, and he was going to find a way to provide it. The early morning mist clung to the ground as Francis shouldered his small backpack. Inside, he'd packed a water bottle, his trusty notebook, and a flashlight. The woods seemed different today, more threatening somehow. Each step toward the clearing felt heavier than usual. When he reached the familiar spot, the mother bobcat stood guard near the den entrance. Her cubs were barely visible, their tiny forms huddled together in the shadows. Francis smiled at the sight, but then something caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat. There in the soft earth were footprints, large, deep impressions that definitely weren't his. The boot treads formed a clear pattern, leading right up to where he now stood. Francis's hands grew cold with worry. Someone else knew about this place. He backed away quickly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the bobcat family. Once he was far enough away, he turned and hurried back through the woods, branches crackling under his feet. An hour later, Francis pulled into the parking lot of the local ranger station. The small wooden building sat nestled among tall pines, its green and brown paint blending with the surroundings. Inside, he met Leah Martinez, a ranger with kind eyes and an attentive expression. "What can I help you with today?" she asked, gesturing for him to take a seat. Francis cleared his throat. "Well, it's about a bobcat family I've been observing." He explained everything: the window tapping, finding the den, and now the mysterious footprints. Leah's expression grew serious. "We've had reports of poacher activity in these parts," she said, leaning forward. "They're after anything they can sell. Pelts, cubs, for the exotic pet trade. When did you notice these tracks?" "Just this morning," Francis replied, his worry deepening. "I'll look into it right away," Leah assured him. "But please be careful, Mr. O'Connor. Poachers can be dangerous. Don't confront anyone you might see near the den." Francis nodded, grateful for her concern and professionalism. Driving home, he noticed Reed Thompson standing at the edge of his property, watching Francis's car approach. Francis raised his hand in a tentative wave, but Reed just turned his back and walked away, his shoulders stiff with obvious displeasure. The soft light of dawn painted Francis's kitchen in gentle hues as he sat at his usual spot by the window. Right on schedule, a familiar tap drew his attention. The mother bobcat stood there, her golden eyes fixed on his. "Hello there," Francis whispered, his voice barely audible through the glass. The bobcat's gaze held steady, and Francis felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a random animal. She was asking for help. He could feel it in his bones. "I won't let anything happen to you or your babies," he promised softly. The bobcat blinked slowly before turning away, disappearing into the misty morning. Francis grabbed his backpack and headed into the woods with renewed purpose. He pulled out a roll of bright orange ribbons he'd bought the day before. Carefully, he tied them at eye level on trees, creating a trail he could follow. The ribbons would help him remember the safe paths and keep track of the territory he needed to protect. The morning air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he worked. He'd been at it for about an hour when something caught his eye, a slight disturbance in the pattern of leaves on the ground. Francis knelt down, brushing aside the leaves with careful fingers. His stomach turned when he found what lay beneath, a cruel metal snare, perfectly positioned to catch any passing animal. With trembling hands, but determined movements, Francis carefully disarmed the trap. The wire felt cold and ugly in his hands as he stuffed it into his jacket pocket. Without wasting any time, Francis drove straight to the ranger station. Inside, he found Leah at her desk, already going through morning reports. "Look what I found," Francis said, placing the snare on her desk. Leah's eyes widened as she picked up the wire. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Francis described the location, watching as she made quick notes. "I've been marking the safe paths with ribbons," he added. "I thought it might help us keep track of the area." Leah nodded approvingly. "That's actually really smart, Francis. Listen, we should set up a proper watch schedule. Would you be willing to help coordinate that?" "Absolutely," Francis replied without hesitation. Despite the knot of worry in his stomach, he felt more alive than he had in years. He had a purpose now, a family to protect. Francis sat on his weathered porch swing, phone in hand. The evening air carried the sweet scent of pine as crickets began their nightly chorus. He dialed Emily's number first, his thumb hovering over the call button for a moment before pressing it. "Hi, Emily, it's Dad again," he said softly when her voicemail picked up. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. There's something amazing happening here that I'd love to share with you." He paused, swallowing hard. "I know things haven't been great between us, but I miss you. Please call when you can." He tried Daniel next, getting the same result. The silence that followed each call felt heavier than before, but something inside him had changed. The bobcat's trust had awakened a fierce determination in him to protect her family and to heal his own. As night fell, Francis grabbed his flashlight and a warm jacket. The woods were different after dark, filled with deeper shadows and unfamiliar sounds. His boots crunched softly on fallen leaves as he made his way between the trees, checking the areas where he'd found the snare earlier. The beam of his flashlight caught the silver threads of spiderwebs between branches, creating tiny moments of beauty in the darkness. But then, a snap of a twig stopped him cold. Francis quickly switched off his light and pressed himself against a thick tree trunk, heart pounding. Footsteps crunched through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. They grew closer, accompanied by the rustle of leaves. Francis held his breath, feeling exposed despite the darkness. The footsteps passed maybe 20 feet away, then gradually faded into the distance. Once he was sure he was alone again, Francis hurried home, his mind racing. Back in his kitchen, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Emily and Daniel," he wrote, his hand shaking slightly. "I know I've been distant since your mother passed. I wrapped myself in grief and shut you both out. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." He paused, tapping his pen against the table. "Something has happened that's helped me see things differently. I've found a purpose again, a chance to protect something precious. It's made me realize how precious you both are to me, too." The letter remained unfinished on the table, words of love and regret waiting to be expressed, as Francis stared out into the darkness beyond his window. The morning sun cast long shadows across Francis's yard as he checked the bird feeder near the fence. Heavy footsteps crunching on dry leaves made him turn. Reed Thompson stood there, his weathered face tight with anger. "Been seeing you skulking around at night," Reed said, crossing his arms. "What are you up to, O'Connor?" Francis straightened his back. "It's not what you think, Reed. There's a Bobcat family." "A Bobcat?" Reed scoffed, shaking his head. "That's your excuse for prowling around my property line?" "There are poachers in the area," Francis explained, keeping his voice steady. "I found a snare just yesterday." "Right." Reed's voice dripped with sarcasm. "First bobcats, now poachers. You trying to stir up trouble?" "I'm trying to protect them," Francis said firmly. "The ranger station is already involved." Reed jabbed a finger in Francis's direction. "Stay on your side of the fence, O'Connor. I mean it." He turned and stalked away, leaving Francis standing alone. Later that morning, Francis made his way carefully through the woods to check on the Bobcat family. The familiar path felt different today, charged with tension after Reed's accusations. As he approached the clearing, something felt off. The entrance to the den looked disturbed. Small branches that had naturally concealed it were broken and shifted. Francis crouched behind a large oak tree, watching. The cubs paced restlessly near the den's entrance, their usual playful behavior replaced by nervous energy. Their mother sat alert, ears twitching at every sound. Francis's heart sank. Someone else had definitely been here. The poachers were getting bolder, coming closer to the den. He wanted to do something, move the branches back, set up some kind of protection, but knew he couldn't risk leaving his scent or drawing more attention to the spot. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. Emily's name lit up the screen. With trembling fingers, he answered. "Dad?" Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Emily," he breathed. "I'm so glad you called." "I got your messages," she said. "You sounded different." Francis watched the mother bobcat gently nudge her cubs deeper into the den. "I am different, or trying to be." "Would you like to have dinner next week?" Emily asked after a pause. "Maybe Thursday?" "I'd love that," Francis said, his voice thick with emotion. "Really love that." "Okay," Emily replied, and he could hear a small smile in her voice. "Thursday, then." After they hung up, Francis stayed quietly observing the Bobcat family, his heart both heavy with worry and light with hope. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake to both the beauty and pain around him. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Leah Martinez's small office at the ranger station. Francis sat across from her desk, his weathered hands tracing paths on the spread-out map between them. "Here's where I found the snare," Francis said, pointing to a spot on the map. "And the den is about 50 yards east of that." Leah leaned forward, her dark eyes focused. "We've had reports of poaching activity increasing in the area." She marked the location with a red pin. "I think we should start patrolling at dusk. That's when they're most likely to be active." Francis nodded, though worry creased his forehead. "I want to help, but I'm concerned about drawing attention to the den." "I understand," Leah said warmly, "but we need to document everything properly. Would you be willing to show me the exact location?" Later that afternoon, Francis led Leah through the forest. The ribbons he'd tied fluttered gently in the breeze, marking their path. Sunlight dappled the forest floor through the canopy above. "Wait," Leah whispered, crouching down. She pointed to fresh boot prints in the soft earth. "These are recent, within the last day." Francis knelt beside her, his heart beating faster. Could they be from other rangers? Leah shook her head, her expression grave. No, these don't match our boot treads, and none of our patrols were scheduled through here yesterday. They exchanged worried glances. The forest seemed to grow quieter around them, as if holding its breath. That evening, Francis sat on his front porch, the cooling air settling around him. The day's discoveries weighed heavy on his mind. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Daniel, he spoke into the voicemail, his voice soft but clear. It's Dad. I know it's been a while, but I'd really like to talk. Some things have happened that, well, they've made me think about what's important. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I miss you, son. Please call when you can. He ended the call and sat back in his chair, watching the sun sink behind the trees. No immediate response came, but for the first time in a long while, hope flickered in his chest like a warm flame. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Leah Martinez's small office at the ranger station. Francis sat across from her desk, his weathered hands tracing paths on the spread-out map between them. Here's where I found the snare, Francis said, pointing to a spot on the map. His finger moved in a circle around the area. And the den is nearby. Leah leaned forward, her dark eyes studying the location. We need to be strategic about this, she said. The poachers usually work at dusk when there's less traffic in the woods. She grabbed a marker and circled several spots. I think we should set up a patrol schedule. Francis nodded, but couldn't hide his worry. I want to show you the den, but I'm concerned about drawing attention to it. I understand, Leah said warmly, but having eyes on the ground is our best defense right now. That afternoon, they walked together through the woods. The sun cast long shadows through the trees, and birds called overhead. Francis led the way, following his ribbon markers tied to branches. You did good work marking these paths, Leah whispered, ducking under a low-hanging branch. Suddenly she stopped and knelt down. Her finger traced the edge of a fresh boot print in the soft earth. These aren't ours, she said, her voice tense. See the tread pattern? None of our rangers wear this type. Francis felt his heart skip a beat. They're fresh? Very. Leah stood up, brushing dirt from her knee. From this morning, I'd guess. The edges are still sharp. She looked around, her expression serious. They're getting bolder. That evening, Francis sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed Daniel's number. The call went straight to voicemail, as usual. Hey, Daniel, he said softly. It's Dad. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. There's so much I want to tell you about, so much I want to make right. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I miss you, son. Please call when you can. As he ended the call, a small smile crossed his face. Despite the unanswered message, something felt different this time. Maybe it was the day's events, or maybe it was just time, but hope flickered in his chest like a tiny flame. The night wrapped around Francis like a heavy blanket as he stepped into the woods. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching glimpses of swaying branches and scattered leaves. His heart thumped steadily in his chest, each step careful and measured. The familiar paths felt different in the dark. Even his ribbon markers, usually so reassuring in daylight, seemed ghostly as they fluttered in the gentle breeze. The usual chorus of crickets and night birds had fallen silent, leaving only the soft crunch of his footsteps. Deeper in the forest, Francis paused. A sound caught his attention. Heavy breathing, followed by hushed whispers. He clicked off his flashlight and pressed himself against a broad oak tree, listening intently. The whispers grew clearer, though he couldn't make out the words. Moving slowly, Francis crept forward. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness now. and the quarter moon provided just enough light to make out shapes. That's when he saw it. A dark figure crouched near a tree about 30 feet ahead. The person's movements were practiced and quick, hands working to set up what looked like a wire snare. Francis's throat went dry. He took a careful step forward, wanting to get closer, to perhaps identify the poacher. But his foot found a dead branch, and the crack seemed to echo through the silent forest like a gunshot. The figure's head snapped up. For a brief moment, everything froze. Then the poacher bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Francis's flashlight beam caught only a glimpse of dark clothing before the figure disappeared into the shadows. His hands trembling slightly, Francis pulled out his phone and dialed Leah's number. She answered on the second ring. "I just saw one of them," Francis said, his voice tight. "Setting up a snare, not far from the den." "Are you safe?" Leah asked immediately. "Yes, but they ran when they heard me. I couldn't see their face." "Come back to the station first thing tomorrow," Leah said firmly. "We'll set up some camera traps. That should give us the evidence we need." Francis agreed and ended the call, his flashlight beam sweeping the darkness around him. The woods felt more threatening now, knowing the poachers were actively working in the area. He turned and began making his way home, more determined than ever to protect the Bobcat family. The morning sun filtered through the leaves as Francis approached the clearing. A small black camera trap caught his eye, expertly hidden among the branches by Leah Martinez. The device's tiny red light blinked steadily, watching over the den like a silent guardian. The mother bobcat's ears twitched at his approach, but she remained calm. Francis smiled, touched by her continued trust. The cubs tumbled and played near the den's entrance, their movements full of life despite recent events. The injured cub still favored its left paw, but its playful spirit hadn't dimmed. It batted at leaves and pounced on its sibling, moving with growing confidence. "You're getting stronger, little one," Francis whispered, keeping his distance to avoid disturbing their morning routine. Later that day, as Francis checked his mailbox, heavy footsteps approached from next door. Reed Thompson stood at their shared fence, his usual skull replaced by an uncertain expression. "O'Connor," Reed called out, his voice gruff but lacking its usual edge. "About what you said yesterday. About the poachers. You weren't making that up?" Francis walked over to the fence, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the wire snare he'd found, holding it up for Reed to see. "Found this myself, Reed. Right here in our woods." Reed's weathered face darkened as he examined the cruel device. "Been hearing strange noises at night," he admitted, running a calloused hand through his gray hair. "Thought it was you at first, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "These people are professionals, Reed. They know what they're doing." Reed nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Well, can't have criminals running around our properties, can we?" The word "our" hung in the air, marking a subtle but significant shift in their dynamic. That afternoon, Francis moved through his house with purpose, dusting surfaces that hadn't seen attention in months. He straightened family photos on the walls, lingering over images of happier times. The dining room table, usually collecting mail and old newspapers, now bore a fresh tablecloth. As he arranged the plates and silverware, his hands trembled slightly. Tomorrow, Emily and Daniel would sit at this table. The thought filled him with equal parts joy and anxiety. He adjusted a fork, then readjusted it, trying to make everything perfect. The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, warming the room. Francis stood back, surveying his work. The table settings gleamed, waiting for his children's return. Like the injured cub in the woods, his family showed signs of healing, taking small steps toward recovery. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Francis's kitchen windows as he made final adjustments to the dinner table. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened the silverware for the third time. The gentle rumble of a car engine made him freeze. Through the window, he watched Emily's blue sedan pull into the driveway, Daniel's familiar figure in the passenger seat. Francis wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and opened the front door. Emily stepped out first, her smile tentative but genuine. Daniel followed, hands in his pockets, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "Hi, Dad," Emily said softly, stepping forward for a brief hug. "Good to see you," Daniel nodded, hanging back slightly. The pot roast steamed on the table as they settled into their seats. Francis's heart pounded as he served the food, the familiar routine feeling somehow foreign after so long apart. "So," Emily broke the silence, "you mentioned something unusual in your messages?" Francis set down his fork, taking a deep breath. "Yes, well, it started with a bobcat." He described the first morning at the window, the mysterious tapping, following the tracks into the woods. As he spoke about discovering the cubs, his voice grew stronger, more animated. "There are poachers in the area," he explained, leaning forward. "One of the cubs was hurt. I've been working with a park ranger named Leah to protect them." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Poachers? Dad, that sounds dangerous." "It matters," Francis said firmly, surprising himself with his conviction. "These animals, they trust me. They need someone to stand up for them." Emily studied her father's face, recognition dawning in her eyes. "I haven't seen you this passionate about anything since—" She trailed off, but they all knew she meant since before their mother's death. After dinner, Emily followed Francis onto the porch. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of spring flowers. "Dad," Emily's voice wavered, "after Mom died, you just disappeared. Even when you were right there, you weren't really there." Francis gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white. "I know. I was lost in my own grief. I failed you both." Emily's eyes welled with tears. "I needed my father." "I'm so sorry," Francis whispered, opening his arms. Emily stepped into them, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Through the screen door, Daniel watched silently, his own eyes glistening in the fading light. The morning dew clung to the grass as Francis led Emily and Daniel through the woods. They moved quietly, following the ribbon-marked path he had created. The filtered sunlight dappled the forest floor, creating shifting patterns through the leaves above. "Watch your step here," Francis whispered, pointing to a raised root. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. As they approached the clearing, Francis held up his hand, signaling them to stop. He gestured toward a fallen log where they could observe without being noticed. The three of them crouched behind it, their shoulders touching. The mother bobcat emerged from the den, her movements graceful and purposeful. Behind her, the two cubs tumbled out, one still favoring its leg slightly. Emily's hand found Francis's arm, squeezing it gently. Daniel leaned forward, his usual reserve melting away as he watched the cubs play. "They're beautiful," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The little one was hurt," Francis explained softly. "That's when I knew I had to do something." They watched for several minutes as the family went about their morning routine. The mother kept a vigilant eye while the cubs explored, their playful energy contained within the safety of her watchful presence. Later, as they explored the surrounding area, Daniel spotted fresh boot prints in the soft earth. They weren't the familiar treads of Francis's shoes or the ranger's boots. "Look at this," Emily called quietly, holding up a piece of wire partially hidden under leaves. "Another snare?" Francis nodded grimly. "They're getting bolder, setting up closer to the den." Daniel crouched to examine the tracks more closely. "These are recent, maybe from last night." "Now you understand why I've been out here so much," Francis said, his voice carrying a mix of worry and determination. Emily touched his shoulder. We'll help you, Dad. We can take shifts. Keep watch. Both of us, Daniel added, standing up. Whatever you need. They made their way back to the house, the morning's discoveries weighing heavily on their minds. On the front porch, Emily turned to Francis. We should have listened sooner, Dad. Those messages you left, we didn't understand. But we do now, Daniel said quietly. And we're here. Francis looked at his children, feeling the distance between them beginning to close. The mission to protect the Bobcats had somehow become a bridge, connecting them in ways he hadn't expected. The morning sun cast long shadows across Francis's yard as he sipped his coffee on the porch. Movement near the fence caught his eye. Reed Thompson was walking toward him, looking uncomfortable but determined. Francis, Reed called out, clearing his throat. Got a minute? Francis nodded, walking to meet his neighbor at the fence line. Reed shifted his weight, then reached into his truck bed nearby. Got some marking tape here, he said, pulling out a box of bright orange ribbons and some tools. And these metal posts might help mark safe zones. Been thinking about what you said about those poachers. Francis's eyebrows rose in surprise. That would help a lot, Reed. Thank you. They shared a tentative handshake across the fence, years of tension beginning to thaw. Later that afternoon, Francis led a small group through the woods, Emily and Daniel following close behind, with Leah Martinez bringing up the rear. They worked methodically, checking for traps and placing warning signs on trees. Dad! Emily's sharp whisper cut through the air. Over here! They rushed to where she stood, frozen. A few yards away, one of the bobcat cubs was struggling against a wire snare wrapped around its back leg. The tiny creature made pitiful mewing sounds that broke their hearts. Everyone stay calm, Leah said, pulling on thick gloves. I've handled this before. They watched anxiously as Leah approached the cub. With steady hands, she worked to loosen the snare while speaking in soft, soothing tones. The cub trembled, but didn't struggle as she carefully freed its leg. As soon as it was released, the cub limped quickly into the underbrush. Daniel let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That could have been so much worse, Emily whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. That evening, they sat around a small campfire in Francis's backyard. The flames cast a warm glow on their faces as they sat in contemplative silence. Daniel looked at his father, seeing him in a new light. Without a word, he moved closer and put his arm around Francis's shoulders. Francis felt tears welling up as he leaned into his son's embrace. The crackling fire and the chorus of evening crickets filled the comfortable silence between them all. The evening air grew crisp as Francis and Leah Martinez prepared for their nighttime stakeout. In Francis's kitchen, they packed their backpacks with essentials, flashlights, water bottles, and warm layers. Leah checked her camera equipment one final time. Emily paced near the door, wringing her hands. Dad, are you sure about this? We'll be careful, Francis assured her, zipping up his jacket. Just stay here with Daniel. We won't be gone long. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, concern etched on his face. Maybe I should come with you. No, Leah interjected firmly. The fewer people, the better. We need to stay quiet and hidden. Francis hugged both his children before heading out into the darkening woods with Leah. They moved carefully through the trees, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. The forest felt different at night, more mysterious, more dangerous. They found their hiding spot behind a large fallen log overlooking an area where they'd previously discovered snares. Leah positioned her camera while Francis kept watch. The hours crept by in silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves. Just past midnight, Francis heard it, the soft crunch of boots on forest floor. He touched Leah's arm gently, alerting her. Two shadowy figures emerged from between the trees, moving with practiced stealth. In the dim moonlight, Frances could make out their dark clothing and backpacks. Leah raised her camera, the lens barely visible over the log. The poachers worked methodically, setting up their cruel traps. Frances's heart pounded as he watched them bend and stretch wire between trees, creating deadly snares. The camera clicked softly, too softly for human ears, but in the silent forest it seemed to echo. One of the poachers straightened suddenly, alert. Frances held his breath. "Did you hear that?" A harsh whisper carried through the darkness. The second poacher froze, then quickly gathered their remaining equipment. Without another word, both figures melted into the shadows, their footsteps fading rapidly into the night. Frances and Leah waited several long minutes before moving. Their joints were stiff from crouching for so long, but adrenaline coursed through their veins. "We got them," Leah whispered, checking her camera screen. "Clear shots of both of them setting traps." They made their way back through the dark woods, moving faster now that stealth wasn't necessary. When Frances's house came into view, he saw Emily and Daniel waiting on the porch, illuminated by the porch light. "Dad!" Emily called out softly, rushing to meet them. "Are you okay?" "We're fine," Frances assured them, accepting their tight hugs. "And better than fine. We got evidence." "The Rangers can take action now," Leah added, patting her camera bag with satisfaction. Daniel squeezed his father's shoulder. "You had us worried sick." "I know," Frances said, looking at his children's concerned faces. "But we're one step closer to keeping those bobcats safe." The morning light streamed through the windows of the ranger station, casting long shadows across Leah's desk. Frances leaned forward, watching intently as Leah connected the video call with the wildlife unit. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. "As you can see here," Leah explained, sharing the footage on screen, "these individuals are clearly setting up illegal traps." The grainy nighttime video showed two shadowy figures crouching near trees. The wildlife officer on screen nodded slowly. "Good work getting this evidence. We can have a team there within 48 hours. Frances's stomach dropped. 2 days? The cubs are already in danger. One was caught in a trap yesterday. "I understand your concern, sir," the officer replied, "but that's our earliest availability." After the call, Frances paced the station's small office. "Leah, 2 days is too long. Those poachers could come back tonight." "I know, Frances. We'll keep monitoring the area ourselves until they arrive." Later that afternoon, Frances was checking his fence line when he heard footsteps approaching. Reed Thompson walked up, his usual scowl replaced with a thoughtful expression. "Frances," Reed called out, stopping a few feet away. "Been thinking about what you said about those poachers." He scuffed his boot in the dirt. "Look, I know we've had our differences, but I can't stand by while someone's hurting animals on our land." Frances blinked in surprise. "What are you suggesting?" "I could help patrol tonight. I know these woods as well as anyone." Reed pulled out a worn map from his back pocket. "We could cover more ground together." They spread the map across the fence post, marking potential hiding spots and patrol routes. Reed's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as they planned their strategy. That afternoon, Frances visited the clearing again. The mother bobcat paced nervously near her den, her usual calm demeanor replaced with visible agitation. The cubs huddled close together, their playful wrestling notably absent. Frances's heart ached at the sight, knowing their peaceful world had been disturbed. The evening sun painted Frances's kitchen in warm golden hues as Emily and Daniel stepped through the door. The aroma of his wife's old lasagna recipe filled the air, bringing soft smiles to their faces. "You made Mom's recipe," Emily said, her eyes brightening. "Tried my best," Frances replied, pulling out chairs for them. though I doubt it's quite as good as hers. Daniel picked up a worn cookbook from the counter, running his fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins. I remember how she used to let me stir the sauce. They settled around the table, passing dishes and sharing memories. The tension from their previous dinner had melted away, replaced by genuine warmth and occasional bursts of laughter. "Remember when Dad tried to make pancakes that Christmas morning?" Emily giggled. "The smoke alarm went off 3 times. Francis chuckled, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "Your mother never let me near the stove on Christmas after that." As they finished their meal, Francis cleared his throat. "I want you both to know how grateful I am. Not just for being here tonight, but for understanding about the Bobcats. It means more than you know." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed his father's hand. "We get it now, Dad. We see what you're trying to do." They moved to the porch after dinner, settling into the old wooden chairs. The evening air was cool and crisp, filled with cricket song. "Leah's organizing a tracking effort tomorrow morning," Emily said. "We want to help." "Both of us," Daniel added firmly. Francis's eyes welled up with tears. He looked at his children, overwhelmed by the realization that his mission to protect the Bobcat family had somehow brought his own family back together. Later that night, after Emily and Daniel had left, Francis stood in his bedroom. He carefully lit a candle and placed it beside an old photograph of his wife. Her smile, captured in that moment years ago, seemed to glow in the flickering light. Francis touched the frame gently, making a silent promise to protect both the creatures in the woods and the family they had created together. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Francis like a heavy blanket as he made his way through the woods. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing the first hints of morning dew on fallen leaves. The familiar path felt different today, more threatening. He stopped suddenly, spotting a glint of metal in the undergrowth. Crouching down, he discovered a cruel-looking snare hidden beneath some leaves. His heart sank as he found another just a few feet away, and then another. These weren't the occasional traps he'd found before. The woods were now littered with them. "This is getting worse," he muttered, carefully disarming each trap he found. The sky began to lighten, bringing with it the gentle chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves. Then he heard it, a sharp, distressed cry that made his blood run cold. Following the sound, Francis pushed through dense brush until he reached a small clearing. There, caught in one of the snares, was one of the bobcat cubs. The mother paced nearby, letting out low growls of concern. Francis approached slowly, speaking in soft, steady tones. "Easy now. I'm here to help." The mother bobcat watched him intently, but didn't retreat, seeming to recognize him from their previous encounters. With trembling but careful hands, Francis worked to free the struggling cub. The wire had caught around its back leg, but thankfully hadn't cut too deeply. After a tense minute, the snare released its grip, and the cub limped quickly back to its mother. As Francis straightened up, a twig snapped behind him. He turned to find a man stepping out from behind a thick oak tree, gripping a wooden club. The stranger's face was hard, his eyes cold. "This ain't your business, old man," the poacher growled, tapping the club against his leg. "Walk away now, and we'll forget this happened." Francis planted his feet firmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I can't do that." Behind him, the mother bobcat let out a threatening growl, her eyes fixed on the poacher. The man's gaze flickered between Francis and the protective mother, uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Francis drew himself up to his full height. "These animals are protected. I won't let you hurt them." The poacher shifted his weight, grip tightening on his club, but the mother bobcat's growl grew louder. After a long, tense moment, he took a step backward. "This isn't over," he spat before turning and disappearing into the trees. Francis's legs felt weak as the adrenaline drained from his body. He leaned against a tree, his hands shaking as he watched the mother bobcat guide her cub back toward their den. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Francis like a heavy blanket as he made his way through the woods. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing the first hints of morning dew on fallen leaves. The familiar path felt different today, more threatening. He stopped suddenly, spotting a glint of metal in the undergrowth. Crouching down, he discovered a cruel-looking snare hidden beneath some leaves. His heart sank as he found another just a few feet away, and then another. These weren't the occasional traps he'd found before. The woods were now littered with them. "This is getting worse," he muttered, carefully disarming each trap he found. The sky began to lighten, bringing with it the gentle chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves. Then he heard it, a sharp, distressed cry that made his blood run cold. Following the sound, Francis pushed through dense brush until he reached a small clearing. There, caught in one of the snares, was one of the bobcat cubs. The mother paced nearby, letting out low growls of concern. Francis approached slowly, speaking in soft, steady tones. "Easy now, I'm here to help." The mother bobcat watched him intently, but didn't retreat, seeming to recognize him from their previous encounters. With trembling but careful hands, Francis worked to free the struggling cub. The wire had caught around its back leg, but thankfully hadn't cut too deeply. After a tense minute, the snare released its grip, and the cub limped quickly back to its mother. As Francis straightened up, a twig snapped behind him. He turned to find a man stepping out from behind a thick oak tree, gripping a wooden club. The stranger's face was hard, his eyes cold. "This ain't your business, old man," the poacher growled, tapping the club against his leg. "Walk away now, and we'll forget this happened." Francis planted his feet firmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I can't do that." Behind him, the mother bobcat let out a threatening growl, her eyes fixed on the poacher. The man's gaze flickered between Francis and the protective mother, uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Francis drew himself up to his full height. "These animals are protected. I won't let you hurt them." The poacher took a hesitant step backward as the mother bobcat's growl grew louder. His grip on the club loosened slightly. After a tense moment, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Francis trembling but standing his ground. Francis drew himself up to his full height. "These animals are protected. I won't let you hurt them." The poacher's grip tightened on his club. "You're making a big mistake, old-timer. These woods ain't yours to guard." A rustling sound drew both men's attention. The mother bobcat had positioned herself between her cub and the poacher, her muscles tensed and ready. Her low growl cut through the morning air like a knife. Francis took a deliberate step forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've already called the rangers. They're on their way. Whatever you're planning, it ends now." The poacher's eyes darted between Francis, the protective mother bobcat, and the dense woods behind him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The mother bobcat's growl grew deeper, more threatening. "You don't know what you're getting into," the poacher warned. But his voice wavered slightly. He took a half step backward, his confidence clearly shaken. Francis stood his ground. "I know exactly what I'm doing. These animals have a right to live here in peace." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. The mother bobcat's unwavering stare and defensive posture seemed to unnerve the poacher more than Francis's words. Finally, the man lowered his club. "This isn't over," he muttered, backing away slowly before turning and disappearing into the underbrush. Francis waited until the sound of retreating footsteps faded completely. His legs felt weak, and he had to lean against a tree to steady himself. The mother bobcat gave him one last look before guiding her limping cub back toward their den. The encounter left Francis trembling, but more determined than ever to protect the bobcat family. The early morning mist hung low over the forest floor as Francis made his way through the trees. His boots crunched softly on fallen leaves, and somewhere nearby, a cardinal called out its morning song. But Francis's attention was fixed on something more sinister, metal glinting in the dim light. "Another one," he muttered, carefully marking the location of yet another snare. He had already found 3 new traps, more than he'd seen before. His stomach tightened with worry as he continued deeper into the woods. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink when a sharp cry pierced the quiet morning. Francis's head snapped toward the sound, his heart pounding. He knew that cry. It was one of the cubs. Moving as quickly as he dared, Francis followed the distressed sounds until he found the source. His chest ached at the sight. One of the bobcat cubs was caught in a cruel wire snare, struggling desperately, while its mother paced nearby, making low sounds of distress. "Easy now," Francis whispered, approaching slowly. The mother bobcat watched him intently, but didn't move to attack. She seemed to recognize him from their previous encounters. With trembling but careful hands, Francis worked to loosen the snare. The cub whimpered, but stayed still, as if understanding Francis was trying to help. After what felt like an eternity, the wire gave way and the cub scrambled free, limping back to its mother's side. Francis exhaled in relief, but as he straightened up, a rough voice broke the morning quiet. "Hey, get away from there!" Francis turned to see a man step out from behind a nearby tree. He wore camouflage clothing and carried a wooden club. His face was hard, eyes cold with anger. "This ain't your business, old man," the poacher growled. "Clear out now, while you can still walk." Francis planted his feet firmly on the ground. His voice shook slightly, but his words were clear. "These animals are protected. I won't let you hurt them." The poacher's grip tightened on his club. "You're making a big mistake, old-timer. These woods ain't yours to guard." A rustling sound drew both men's attention. The mother bobcat had positioned herself between her cub and the poacher, her muscles tensed and ready. Her low growl cut through the morning air like a knife. Francis took a deliberate step forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've already called the rangers. They're on their way. Whatever you're planning, it ends now." The poacher's eyes darted between Francis, the protective mother bobcat, and the dense woods behind him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. After a tense moment, he took a step backward, then another. "This isn't over," he spat, before turning and disappearing into the trees. Francis remained standing until the sound of the poacher's footsteps faded completely. Only then did his legs begin to shake, the full weight of what had just happened hitting him all at once. The morning sun warmed Francis's backyard as he watched Emily struggle with an overgrown bush. Her face scrunched up in concentration, just like when she was little and trying to tie her shoes. Daniel worked nearby, raking leaves into neat piles, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms tanned from working outdoors. "Remember when you used to hide in these bushes?" Francis called out to Emily, a smile tugging at his lips. Emily laughed, wiping sweat from her forehead. "And you'd pretend you couldn't find me, even though my feet were sticking out?" "Those pink sneakers with the glitter," Daniel chimed in. "You could spot them from space." They worked together, clearing dead branches and pulling weeds. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. Francis noticed how Daniel's shoulders had relaxed, how Emily's smile came more easily now. The morning passed in a blur of shared stories and gentle teasing. Around noon, the creak of the fence gate made them all look up. Reed Thompson stood there, holding a wicker basket filled with fresh vegetables. His usual stern expression had softened. "Thought you might like some of my tomatoes," Reed said, walking over. "They came in real good this year." Francis wiped his hands on his jeans and met Reed halfway. The other man shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "Listen, Francis," Reed began. "I wanted to thank you for speaking up about those poachers. Could have been my land they were messing with, too. And," he paused, clearing his throat, "I'm sorry about all that fuss over the property line. Guess sometimes we forget what's really important." Francis nodded, extending his hand. "Water under the bridge, Reed." The two men shook hands firmly, years of tension dissolving in that simple gesture. "This land," Reed said, looking out over the trees, "it's something special, isn't it?" "That it is," Francis agreed. As evening approached, delicious smells wafted from Francis's kitchen. Leah Martinez arrived just as he was pulling a lasagna from the oven. They gathered around the table, plates filled with food and hearts full of contentment. "The wildlife unit did another sweep today," Leah announced, passing the salad bowl to Emily. "No new traps, no signs of the poachers. Looks like they've moved on for good." A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the room. Francis looked around at the faces gathered at his table, his children, his once enemy turned friend, and the dedicated ranger who'd helped make it all possible. The warmth he felt had nothing to do with the evening sun streaming through the windows. Golden morning light streamed through Francis's dining room windows, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table. Steam rose from coffee cups as the family settled into their chairs, the familiar scent of pancakes filling the air. Emily traced the rim of her coffee mug. "Mom used to make these exact same pancakes," she said softly, "with vanilla and a pinch of cinnamon." "She'd always save the first one for you, Dan," Francis added, looking at his son, "even when it was burnt." Daniel smiled, his eyes glistening. "She said the burnt ones had more character." They shared gentle laughter, and for the first time in years, memories of their mother brought comfort instead of pain. Francis watched his children's faces, seeing traces of his late wife in their expressions. "I miss her every day," Francis said, his voice steady. "But she would be proud of us, finding our way back to each other." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "She always said you had the biggest heart, Dad. I see that now, with everything you did for those bobcats." After breakfast, Francis stepped onto his front porch. The morning air was crisp, and leaves rustled in a gentle breeze. He gazed at the woods, where the Bobcat family had changed his life. Though the mother no longer tapped on his window, he felt her presence in the renewed strength of his family bonds. The forest stood peaceful and protected, much like the healing that had taken place in his heart. Francis breathed deeply, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over him. The mission to protect the Bobcats had given him purpose, but more importantly, it had brought his family back together. Around noon, Leah arrived with her camera, and Reed Thompson crossed the yard to join them. They gathered on the porch steps, Francis in the center, Emily and Daniel on either side, with Leah and Reed flanking them. "Everyone say Bobcat," Leah called out, setting the camera timer. The group laughed, their smiles genuine and warm. The camera flashed, capturing the moment of unity and hope. As Emily and Daniel prepared to leave, loading their bags into their cars, Francis stood on the porch watching them. They turned and waved, their faces bright with smiles that promised future visits and shared moments. Francis's gaze drifted to the distant tree line, his heart full of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought healing to his family. If you enjoyed the story of Francis, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.